Tons of Final Fantasy XIV players are upset with the new Manderville Relic weapons, and it's more complicated than you think. I want to go into why because it has a lot to do with the future of the game's direction, and honestly has nothing to do with how they look, for the most part anyway. For those of you who aren't familiar, Relic weapons are special, gorgeous looking weapons that usually involve a heavy grind component. They've historically involved things like running tons of old content, some crafting, and spending time in special exploration zones designed for the Relic quest. What's notable about them is that they take a lot of time and effort to complete. If you only play for a few hours a week, it could take a month or two to complete one. The Manderville Relic weapons so far are drastically different. There's no special zone to explore and there are no old content requirements. All you have to do is collect astronomy tomes. As of this video, you can finish the first glowy step of the weapon with 3,000 tomes, which isn't a lot if you run daily quests semi-regularly on a 90 job. This probably sounds pretty good, right? Less grind to get what you want? As it turns out, not for everybody. It's important to be clear here before I get yelled at on Twitter that there's nothing wrong with enjoying how things are now. For people with limited time, this is by far the most approachable of any relic at this phase of the weapon. The problem for some is what we sacrifice to get that. Lots of people are saying that the weapons are just too easy to get, that they don't give them enough to do. What does that really mean? Let's look at the first step of the Heavensward Relic. First, you have to run fates in each of the 6 zones of the expansion to get crystals. Then, to get the glow in the weapon, you have to run through 10 dungeons. Keep in mind that while doing this today is easy, the drop rates for the crystals were much lower when this was current content. Likewise with the dungeons, you couldn't just unsync them and solo them like you can now. It's a lot more involved, and having to do content that you wouldn't normally be doing meant that you probably ran into other players who are working on the Relic frequently. This gave the Relic weapons a shared sense of community progression. I probably don't have to explain the enjoyment you can get from working together with others on a common goal. Because the Manderville weapons don't require you to do these kinds of things, you don't get that same feeling. Another complaint is that finishing the quest quickly means that you get bored faster, or so it would seem at least. This is where the content drought comes into play. This is one of the biggest complaints of Final Fantasy XIV for players who want to play the game all the time. Once you've exhausted the patch content, you don't have much else to do. You've done the normal raids, you've done the few main story quests, you finished the Alliance raid, what else is there? The Relic quest in the past has helped to fill this void by giving you a long list of tasks to accomplish. I'll be honest and say that I personally don't think that this is a strong complaint. I've never really liked the idea of being forced to run old content over and over again just to progress a Relic. Square definitely saw this problem too. That's how we ended up with the Stormblood and Shadowbringers relics. If you're new, you may have heard of Bozja or Eureka, which are sometimes referred to as exploration zones. They were created for the previous 2 Relic quests and were an evolution of the old style of running old content. Eureka came first and gave us huge zones to explore with a drastically different feel from the rest of the game. It involved a lot of player discovery and even added some unique aggro mechanics. It was also the only way to progress the Stormblood relics. That meant no old content running and no tome collecting. If you liked Eureka, this is great. If you didn't, you probably quit early or wish that it was more like the previous relics where you could run content that you at least knew that you liked. And then along comes the Bozja Relic and Shadowbringers, which brought some fixes to this issue. To progress the Bozja Relic weapons, many of the steps gave you multiple ways to progress. You could progress the weapons in Bozja, which was a Eureka-like zone, or you could instead run old content. Both parties are pretty happy, or so it would seem anyway. Bozja had a few issues too. It came in the package that many would say is a really visually boring zone, especially once you spent hours in it. Even though some of the Relic could be progressed outside of Bozja, it still required story progress within Bozja to keep going down the questline. On the other side of this coin, some steps actually did require you to leave Bozja and run old content anyway. These were definitely some of the most hated steps of the entire Relic. If you ever found people talking about Bozja or Eureka on places like Reddit or YouTube before the Manderville Relics came out, they were often criticized pretty heavily. That's what makes the current opinion on the Manderville Relics so interesting, because a lot of people have seemed to change teams. I'm seeing people wishing that we had something like Bozja back. Both Bozja and Eureka gave you a very different experience from the rest of the game, and that shared sense of progression is now gone. For a lot of people, there's just not much to do. I recently started and finished a Eureka weapon of my own, and I honestly love the community interaction involved. There are tons of people around organizing fate parties to progress the content, and even a handful of discords to find others to play with too. I haven't experienced many other moments in the game that really force you to work with other players and talk to each other. It's a big part of the appeal of playing an MMO to me. While I do agree that they have their issues, I'm definitely in the camp of wanting an exploration zone over having to just collect tomes. What I think is important here about the content draw is the community desire to need more things to do. Many people seem to feel like we lost the big Relic quest experience and that Square is simply doing less when this isn't the case. Let's look at what we've gained so far in Endwalker. The 2 notable new things, the Variant Criterion Dungeon and the Island Sanctuary. These 2 pieces of content are a really good example of how it's hard to keep an MMO population occupied. A lot of MMO play is reward driven. After doing something for the first time, they're often not going to want to run something again without a reason to. Aside from any difficulty clearing content, Savage raiding wouldn't last as long as it did if you could gear up in a week. Despite the intent, Island Sanctuary ended up being something that you could complete quickly and was not very time gated. In my opinion, that's not a bad thing, but it also meant that people were finished with it within the first few weeks. This was the same for the Criterion dungeon. Not only was it a lot more challenging than even extreme content tends to be, you really didn't get much for beating it. The Savage version only gave you cosmetics and no special gear progression. Anybody who wanted the really fancy chair could grind out the mount and then never go back again. Likewise for the Variant dungeon, you're probably not going to touch it after you finish the storyline. At least you're able to solo it, I guess, huh? Without a roulette or something else to incentivize you to go back in, why would you bother? Now keep in mind, I think that both of these were fantastic additions to the game. I just think that people overlook them often because they aren't incentivized to run them over and over again, even if they are big features. I'll also add that Island Sanctuary isn't going to be for everyone anyway because there's no combat involved. What's the big takeaway here? Well, for one, the lack of an exploration zone was mentioned in one of the live letters. This gives me a lot of confidence that we will have an exploration zone in the next expansion. Going forward, they don't have to develop Island Sanctuary and Criterion dungeons from scratch now. The groundwork's already in place, so they just have to add more dungeons and more additions to the Sanctuary. That means more time to spend on things like whatever the next Boja or Eureka looks like. As far as what you can do now, there's a ton of content, and I recommend exploring things that you maybe haven't tried before. If you only want combat, try out Extreme Trials, Savage Raids, or even Ultimates. And please let me know in the comments if you need help getting into that stuff. It's not nearly as scary as you think. Also, the old relics are still around, so you can still go back and grind some of those if you want. Lots of social events happen every day if you check Party Finder, and this can be a fun way to spend time while making new friends. You also get to see how creative others can be with the housing and glamour system. What about trying out crafting or housing decoration? Even if you can't win a house, you could still get an apartment. You could even get into things like doing treasure maps or mount grinds. Something I like to do with my friends is trying out old extremes with minimum eye level and no echo enabled. This way I get to experience a taste of how hard things were back then. This has been great since I really only started playing in Shadowbringers. A lot of people watching this video probably started within the last two expansions. That means that there's a ton of game to explore, and you'd be surprised at how willing people are to join you in experiencing the old stuff. Toss up a listing on Party Finder to see how it goes, or join Discords where people organize events like this all the time. And lastly, the thing that you might not want to hear, consider taking a break. Even the devs themselves encourage people to take breaks between patches. I know that this isn't the most appealing option, and Final Fantasy XIV really feels like home to a lot of people. If you're in a static or a free company, you could try playing other games with them. There are a million different ways to make your own fun in the game, and I could probably make an entire video talking about that, so I won't derail too hard on that here. I just hope that this gave you some perspective on why people enjoy the old Relic quest, beyond just wanting a mindless grind for no reason. And sometimes, maybe you do just want a mindless grind, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you enjoy hearing me talk about Final Fantasy and want to see more vids like this, please give me a subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.